Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Get started. Yeah, this is a really exciting session that we're going to be having this evening, and we're so lucky to have Jay Havens here with us today. So just a bit of background about this project. The Meadowvale Theatre closed for renovations earlier this year, and um, it's looking to reopen in the summer of 2022. So part of the renovations of this project include a public art component. After discussions with the public art team and the architects for the project and the project renovation team, it was decided that the bulkhead area around the theater control room and above the concession stand would be an ideal canvas for public art. So it's three-sided. This front section, and then this side that's facing kind of the courtyard area. So the artwork is going to span around this whole section, and it's a really amazing canvas. I'm super excited about it. It's really visible from kind of every angle of the theater lobby space. So right when you enter through these doors over here, when you're getting your concessions, when you're relaxing, waiting for a show, or having an event or a meeting out in this area, you'll be able to see and experience um, the, uh, the artwork. Earlier this year, we hosted a national call for artists, and we had an external art selection committee that was put together that included representation from the architects, from the Meadowvale Theatre Community Panel Group, as well as professional artists as part of that committee. And Jay Havens was the selected artist that came out of that process. My name is Philippa. I am a public art curator with the city of Mississauga, and I'm kind of the main project manager for this public arts piece. So I'm really happy to be with you all today and to have you all here.
Cool. Hi everyone. Let's just make sure I'm the main screen you can see, because I'm going to be doing some presentations. So if this still appears as a thumbnail to you, maybe find a way to make me the main screen you're looking at. So that's probably good, right? So I think it's important to start out this talk by just recognizing the traditional territory that Meadowvale sits on. I'll be talking a little bit about that more today, just to give everyone some background on the area you live and the area where I come from. So Meadowvale and Mississauga sits on the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the former Attawandarunk nations. Lake Ontario is a real shared territory. It's been that way for about 10,000 years. Since the ice retreated, there was people living in and around Lake Ontario, and there's a very long history there, a very rich history of complex societies forming over thousands of years. And I myself am happy to say that I am descendant from the Kanien'kehá:ka people. My mom comes from the Grand River Territory, also known as the Six Nations Reserve. My dad is from Brantford for a couple of generations, and his grandma's from Glasgow. So I'm a mix of Canadian and Indigenous. I have status to Six Nations, and I grew up visiting there and going there. And for some time now, though, I've been living on the Pacific. So here's a little map to explain what I'm talking about. The purple flag here in the right hand side is traditional Haudenosaunee territory. So you can see Lake Ontario there. And those two stars are the areas where I've lived and where I come from. The star on the left is Six Nations Reserve, and then The star on the right there in the purple circle is Ithaca, New York, where I lived for some time. And that's actually the ancestral territory of the Haudenosaunee in northern New York there. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But beginning in the 1970s, my family, my Mohawk family, left Six Nations, and my grandmother became a registered nurse. And she actually administered in the northern regions of Canada up in Haida Gwaii. So she was living up in that area for almost 30 years practicing, and my aunt was there as well, and almost all of my aunts and uncles have lived up in Haida Gwaii for some time. My grandmother carries a Haida name, and then I moved out in the mid 90s to a place known as Soltemuch in the Halkomelem language, which is the Fraser Valley, and that's in British Columbia, and that's kind of the green circle on this map. And so that's the star there. And so a lot of my knowledge comes from the West Coast, my indigenous knowledge. I've never attended actual Haudenosaunee Longhouse. The Longhouse that I've attended when I do attend is the Potlatch system on Vancouver Island, where I currently live, on the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Suminis Nation. So I've lived out in Coast Salish territories for about 25, maybe 28 years now. And I am by ancestry, though, Haudenosaunee. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is they're known as the people of the Longhouse, and their ancestral territory is northern New York. The history books, they call us the Iroquois. So if you ever have read or learned about the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee and the Iroquois are the same people. The Confederation of the Haudenosaunee was created around 1,000 years ago, and it's made of 6 separate nations or territories. So think of some ways it's kind of like the Haudenosaunee would be like the federal body, and then you've got the kind of smaller bodies of government within that. So you've got the Mohawk Nation, the Oneida Nation, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Sixth Nation to join the Confederacy was in the 1700s, and they were the Tuscarora, and they came up from the Carolinas because of the colonial pressures down there, and we adopted them into the Confederacy and gave them space to live among the former 5 nations, and we became the 6 nations. So I'll show you a little map of Haudenosaunee traditional territory, and I'll tell you a little bit of how we came to be up on the 6 nations in that area where I currently come from, or where my mom comes from. So Haudenosaunee ancestral territory, as I mentioned earlier, is northern New York, kind of known as the Finger Lakes region of New York, if you've ever been down there. And really it ran from about the Hudson River all the way over to Lake Erie. And during the 1770s, during the American Revolution, a lot of the Haudenosaunee had sided with the British. And of course, the British lost that war and retreated into the area that we call Canada today. And the Haudenosaunee were essentially chased out of our ancestral territories by orders of George Washington and his government. So there's a campaign called the Sullivan Campaign that moved through northern New York, and essentially their mandate was to burn Haudenosaunee villages and commit genocide in northern New York. And Joseph Brant, this is whose picture is in the cut there, he took a number of Haudenosaunee people who were allied with the British, and he took us to safety and had the British purchase land called the Haldimand Tract from the Mississaugas. And we were given this territory in exchange for our partnership in an allyship in the American Revolution. So the town of Brantford, if you've heard of that place, that's where I was born, is actually named for Joseph Brant. So that town actually has the name of a Mohawk diplomat and chief. That's a little bit of history of my family. This project has me doing a little bit of research into the Mississauga territory. So for those of you who don't already know, I'm going to run through how I understand it from the research I've been doing. So the area of Mississauga, there's been a number, I think treaties were beginning to be signed in this area around the 1780s. And you see the landmass for the Mississaugas of the Credit kind of shrinking and shrinking over about a 50 to 70 year period. And the pressures were probably very extensive for the settlement taking place in that time. And you see under a number of these treaties being signed, the landmass just getting smaller and smaller until eventually in 1847, as I understand it, or 48, the Mississaugas who were living on a mission at the time were still facing colonial pressures and requested to be moved to the Six Nations of the Grand River because we had land there and our landmass had been shrinking too. And so we actually adopted the Mississaugas back onto their traditional territory, and that's where the Mississauga of the Credit are today, next to Six Nations. So that's a bit of interesting history that I'm still figuring out the intricacies of. But as you know, the city of Mississauga is named for the people that used to live on that river. So that's a little bit of the colonial history. I think it's lots of fun to focus a little bit too on the longer history of the Great Lakes and the area that we live in. The colonial history is only 1 to 2% of this larger time span that people were living in this area. So, the Haudenosaunee are the people of the Longhouse. This is a diagram of a reimagined village that I made. It's currently, it's like an animation that will be shown at the Imaginative Film Festival coming up in October. So I think you can buy tickets to view this film on the Imaginative webpage. And I think it's airing on October 19th is when the premiere is. But essentially, the Haudenosaunee, the people around this area in the Great Lakes, we've been like a multicultural society for some time. We would stay in one area and we were a farming and an agricultural society. And from my research, the farming techniques of the Haudenosaunee, the Three Sisters gardening, were actually more successful than what was happening in Europe at the time with the grain farming. We were feeding around 9 to 12 people per acre, whereas the European farming methods were about 2 or 3 people less than what we were doing here per acre. So you can imagine a village around 10,000 acres. 10,000 people would have I think they said around 400 acres or something like this is what I've read up around the area of, what's the village I'm thinking of right now? Campbellville. There's a park up there, Philippa. I can't remember what it's called right now. That lake. Is it Campbell Lake? Anyway, there's a public park that's close.
Lake?
What is it?
Crawford?
Crawford, that's it. So yeah, Crawford near Campbellville. That's it. So Crawford Lake had a fairly large settlement at it, from my understanding. And when you think about how beautiful those gardens must have been, and you think about our traditions, and children were raised in the gardens because they were the ones keeping pests away. It's a really beautiful thing that I like to imagine. Anyways, so this is a film about it. Oh yeah, and the other thing I was going to mention too about this and the economy that we lived in is we were producers of sugar. So we had a lot of maple sugar, and what was traded amongst nations wasn't necessarily thought of as like goods back in the day. It was a lot of knowledge was exchanged. So the corn growing techniques that we had as Haudenosaunee people likely came up from places like Navajo through the Mississippi. And you can actually get from the Mississippi River into the Great Lakes by portage. So there's a lot of history there. We find in the area where we live, where you folks live now in Mississauga, there's like archaeological evidence of like wider trade and Haudenosaunee people. We had peach orchards that we likely got the knowledge of harvesting peaches and things like stone fruit from the Carolinas. We have an alligator dance in Haudenosaunee society, which comes from the Choctaw, the Florida, the nations down in Florida. So this notion that like indigenous people were these kind of sequestered little groups of people is quite false. I think that's something that like is exciting and we're just starting to acknowledge today. You know, the Algonquin languages actually go from like Quebec all the way across to like the Rockies. So you think about that being like as large a space as modern day China. You know, that's the cultural influence. So that's really interesting to think about all of that. And same thing with Haudenosaunee people. There's older words and languages that we have that are related to Cherokee, I believe. Another place that's really interesting that I've learned about recently is the mound builders in Cahokia, which is where modern day St. Louis is. And they have a lot of like cultural relevance down there. I have an aunt who lives down there and has been talking to the descendants of those people, the Shawnee. And there's a lot of cultural, you know, in our cosmology, for instance, there's a relationship to Haudenosaunee people. So yeah, this is just a little bit of like starting to get my mind going and thinking about how to like speak of these things, perhaps in the mural. So as Philippa was saying, I'll get back to the mural now. As Philippa was saying, the Meadowvale Theatre hosted a public art call, you know, earlier this year. They gave out this image and asked for applications and qualification packages. And I was lucky enough to be selected after a selection process. And I'll run through a little bit of what I do for work so that everyone can see perhaps why I was successful in the application process. So I'm traditionally, well, not traditionally, but I am trained professionally as a set and costume designer. So I have experience working for the stage already. This is an example of some work that I've done previously for a company called Access Theatre. I have a long working relationship with them. They're located on Granville Island in Vancouver. And they're a children's theater company, and this is a show that we made where I did the set, costumes, and props and some masks for this show. But I really involved a lot of the Indigenous community around me because this show was a Kwantlen story. So the nation whose territory we were telling the story of, I was able to go to regalia makers and people who are carvers and actually have them make, you know, make things for us so that it was a way of like community exchange. So I was designing the show, but for the feast dish in the middle here, for instance, this is a good example. I made a sketch and then I gave it to an artist named Don Froze and said, you know, can you make us a feast dish and design us a feast dish that is puppetable? And he agreed to do it with the expectation that when the show was finished touring after a number of years, we would return the feast dish to him and he could use it in his healing lodge. So that's what we did. He actually carved a feast dish for us from a cedar tree on his property, and we toured with it around Canada. It actually made it into Fort Langley, which is where the Proclamation of British Columbia was signed. So to have a physical feast dish from the Indigenous nation whose territory we're on inside that room was just incredible. And then he has that feast dish back on his property now. And then also we had Carrie Lynn Victor, who's a really well-known mural artist, design this house post here, which is the mouse house post. It's something you might not find traditionally in the culture, but the show, the chief of the nation in the show was actually a mouse. So we wanted to have them represented on the house post. Yeah, some of the other stuff I do, this is Sedna, pardon me for the jumping around here. This is Sedna at Caravan Farm Theatre that I've produced some costumes for. This is a theater company that's based in Armstrong, BC, and you can actually um, take a horse sleigh ride, and the audience sits on the sleighs and they watch the show from the sleighs, and you are taken around the farm to different set locations where the actors will perform different scenes. They also have a summer show, and that you get on wagons instead of sleighs. So we did a show there that was an Indigenous production with Urban Inc. out of Vancouver, written by Renalta Arluk, called Sedna. And this is an example of some renderings that I've done for that. And then sometimes I also produce public artwork. So this is a piece that I made this summer. I'm not sure if any of you were able to catch this down in the harbor front of Toronto. But this is my rendition um, of a Haudenosaunee story called The Peacemaker's Story, and it's about the creation of the great law of peace, and it's about a shining canoe with a Wendat diplomat named Daganowida. In this shining canoe, he went across the lake to Haudenosaunee territory in northern New York, and he brought peace to the Five Nations, thereby creating the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And it's been said that this event took place about 1,000 years ago, and that we've had that form of government ever since. And our form of government actually went on to influence the Declaration, or the U.S. Constitution. Ben Franklin and a number of the founding fathers actually sat in council with Haudenosaunee chiefs and asked them about their form of government and federalism. Of course, they changed it. In our government, there's a place for women. They kind of take the position of, say, the Supreme Court in the U.S. Constitution. We call ours clan mothers, but they've got a lot of power in our government system. Yeah. A lot of the work I do is also digital. So this is an animation I made for the city of Stratford, and we projected projection mapping, where you actually trim the projection to fit the contours of the building. And this was a Festival of Light last winter during COVID. I actually made this whole project remotely from my studio here in Ladysmith. And we had an animation company projected on the walls, but I was still here trimming everything and animating it to the size of the building. So I had to make a scaled rendering and an animation. It was pretty fun. It was one of my first endeavors in actual animation. And then I also make murals. So this is also why I was chosen for this particular project. Is I have a history of designing digital murals that are printed. This is a work that I did on the Vancouver Opera House in downtown Vancouver. And it's a 3-story tall by 150 feet long mural called Our Heart Beats. And it's about, it was like a series of Indigenous people holding drums and having rattles, and essentially speaking about music and the heartbeat of the drum also being like a sign of protest, and letting them know that we're still here, our heart continues to beat. And it was kind of done in a vinyl rainbow that was put on the windows. And then sometimes I do painted murals as well. So this is a hand-painted mural in the Iroquois Museum in Cobleskill, New York. And it's down in the Children's Museum, where the kids can come down and actually practice some Haudenosaunee basket weaving in the corner. So you can see we made the mural about basket makers. So there's 2 elders here and a youth in the corner learning the tradition of basket making, kind of helping their grandma make a basket. So this is the view of the Meadowvale lobby. You can see here, this is the first panel someone will see when they come into the lobby. And I really don't know what we're going to put up here yet. This is the purpose of our talk today, is to get everybody's creative juices flowing. And I'm really anxious and excited to hear from you folks if there's ideas that you might have. Essentially, the mandate is that we're going to collect stories and collect information from the community. I'm going to come back into my studio here and kind of stew with all that for a while and come out with a sketch or two. And then we're going to edit that sketch and make the story fit on these panels. So when you first come in the lobby, you see this kind of slice of the panel as you walk into the remodeled lobby. And as you walk forward around to where the concession stand is, you'll come around and see this glass panel above the concession stand. So I've kind of added some sort of color to the glass. It's a bit different than the rendering that was on the title page of this talk. We're searching for some colors that we're going to marry well into the lobby and marry well with the finishes that are going to be put in there by the architecture firm. So this panel here above the concession, this one panel is about 33 feet long. Panel A is about 8.5 feet long, I believe. I think the panels are around 6.5 to 7. I don't have the exact measurements, but there's a slide coming up that has them that I'll show you. So you'll see this larger panel will be, the lineup for the concession. If there is one, will kind of be right underneath this. And behind that, as Philippa said, is the control booth for the theater. So behind that panel is the stage manager and people calling the show. And then as you walk around the other side, there's an exit into a little cafe like seating area where there's some tables and things outside. And when you come back in, this is the panel you'll see. I think there's also maybe a washroom tucked away here by the water fountain. And yeah, so this section is about 12 feet long. And I'm kind of viewing it a little bit like a linear thing, but also with the idea that people will be able to view it from the other side as well. So that's sort of the layout of the land. Some of the themes that we're thinking about already, we've had some consultation with people who work at the theater, a number of community people who are invested, and then also the architecture firms. And some of the things that we've been talking about is depicting things like community gathering and talking about notions of what brings community together. Things like performances and things like storytelling is something that even has a longer tradition than, say, the formal theater, and dance is also something has a very long tradition. Also, like dance and performance is very culturally diverse, kind of like the city is today. We're looking at celebrating the arts, so maybe not just performing arts, but also maybe some like crafting or like traditional arts. So that's something I'm interested to know too, is who in Mississauga is practicing the arts of their ancestors. In what way are you folks also carrying on traditions of your ancestors? And that's what makes our traditions and our culture resilient. So we've been thinking about notions of resiliency and tradition and family time. The building of traditions at theater is very big. So the idea of holiday celebrations and the tradition of going to see performance. I know there's a lot of dances that take place within the Meadowvale Theatre, like dance competitions. So that's another tradition and a form of family that might be depicted. So that idea too of tradition also brings in ideas of cycles of time and memory. The seasons, as I said before, traditions based around the seasons is a multicultural notion. So these are kind of the things that we've been stewing with, and we'd love to get your feedback on. We're almost done here. We're coming up on just a few more slides. So the style of the mural that I'm making is, this was a question that came up last time, and I realized I didn't have a slide in it. So I wanted to explain a bit to you about woodland art and the history of contemporary Indigenous art making. So I'm just going to take a sip of water here. The woodland style of art was kind of started in, say, like the second half of the last century. Norval Morrisseau is someone who's often named as one of the creators of this art form. He's very well known. So is Daphne Adojig, but she's kind of not spoken about as much. And I always like to uplift her because she definitely had a really big role in promoting the woodland art, the School of Art. So the Indigenous Group of Seven, or the Indian Group of Seven, is what they were known as in the 1970s. So Daphne, she used to. The reason I like to uplift her too is she used to live in BC for a time at a place called Cultus Lake. She had a strawberry farm there, and I always used to vacation as a child at Cultus Lake. So I kind of have that little slice of just knowing the land that Daphne Adojig was on early on in her life too. And this is a really famous mural of hers called The Indian in Transition. And I can't remember the year that it's from, but it's during the 1970s. And her style of woodland art is, what makes woodland art is this kind of dark outline with various colors inside and these kind of energy lines. So there's lots of flow and direction happening. This is the style of art that I make. You kind of saw it in the past slide in the museum and the one of the mural at the Opera House. So this mural called the Indian in Transition, it kind of reads linearly, and it's kind of telling the history of Turtle Island of North America. So at the beginning here, where the blue arrow is, you can see there's a thunderbird with their kind of wings outreached, and there's indigenous people underneath playing the drum, and then you can kind of see the like energy lines coming out of that hand going to the people. And then as we move our way across the mural, kind of around where maybe the green arrow would be. Oh, it's a bit moved on this, but a bit to the left of where the green arrow would be, you can see there's the arrival of a canoe with like a white-faced person in it. And then underneath that, there's images of like the broken drum. And that's the idea of like the arrival of settlers and colonization starting to come in. And then in the middle there too, you've got another person up above holding a book, which is the Bible, and kind of ministering, and you see all these kind of blue bodies heading towards them. But then coming out of that, where the red arrow is, you've got people coming out of that holding the drum again, and another thunderbird with their arms kind of open. And you can see there's a number of people underneath that thunderbird where the drum is made whole again. So I really love this piece. It's a very well-known mural of hers. But that's an example of the storytelling that can be found in woodland art. Her and the group of seven weren't the only one doing this. Oscar Howe was kind of doing a similar thing down in New Mexico and in the States at the same time. And what really I kind of call this generation of art makers the like forefathers and the grandmothers of like contemporary Indigenous art, because they were really producing art during a time when Indigenous art was not being accepted by the gallery. It was more being regimented to like archaeological sites, like archaeological museums and stuff, and more like ethnographic. So like Daphne Adojig, for instance, and Norval Morrisseau were being told early on in their careers that their art didn't look indigenous enough, and because it was made with, because it wasn't made out of natural materials and traditional materials, that they didn't have a place in contemporary art makings, or indigenous art making rather. And Daphne Adojig went and opened her own art gallery, and Oscar Howe was part of a institute started in the late 60s, early 70s in New Mexico called the Institute of American Indian Arts, the IAIA, and it's still operational. It's a university just for Indigenous teachings. You can attend and graduate with a BFA and a number of different arts-based degrees that they have. And it's based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's a beautiful campus and still running today. So he was one of the first people to kind of help set that up. And they really paved a space, Daphne Adojig and those groups of people really made a way for the next generations of artists to produce work. This is an example of some contemporary artwork. It's a friend of mine, Richard Haikea Sewan, And you can see he's made a pride flag out of a buffalo hide. He's kind of dyed the buffalo hide. And there is definitely a space for this kind of art making now. And that's kind of why I'm able to do what I'm doing today, is because of the woodland art up here in Canada, really paving a way in galleries for us. This is the work of Sun Ysu. I really like the humor in his art. So he's a contemporary Coast Salish artist from here in BC. You can see he's got quite a bit of humor. He made this Enjoy Coast Salish territory sign that looks like the Coca-Cola. He made that during the Vancouver Olympics and placed it in several prominent places along the highways and different billboards in town. And then people too, like Gail Tremblay, are making traditional forms of like basket making out of like film. So that's another form of like picking up the traditions of our ancestors and kind of making more contemporary art with it. And this deer here is actually my artwork. I call it the bargain hunted buck, and it's a basket that's been made in this kind of fancy basket way. But instead of using wood, I'm using recycled fast food and grocery store bags. So they're like the refuse of our food gathering. And you can see here, of course, this is hung on a branch, the basket of a deer. It's hung in a way that you might butcher a deer if you were hunting it. So it's a speaking a little bit to food resources in a contemporary time. So bouncing back to Meadowvale Theatre, you can see here these panels. The top one is 33 feet by 6 feet 6, and then we've got 12 foot on panel C and 8 foot 2 on panel A. And I think that it's going to be a long artwork, so there's really some room to tell a story that's looking at the Mississauga and like performance and all these themes that we were talking about before. We kind of reviewed a little bit, or Philippa reviewed a little bit of the timeline that is we're looking at for the renovations. We're collecting stories until the end of October. So if you folks want to go online, or you know anyone who lives in the region, or someone who perhaps lived in Meadowvale and moved away, or anything like this, I hope that they could go to this webpage and fill out a couple of these questions. And there's even a place to submit photographs if you wanted. Because quite often I use photographs as inspiration for my woodland art. So here's a good example of that. These are some students that I worked with, and we had discussions about some of the different Indigenous actions that had been taking place, like the MMIW, the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, as well as Idle No More, and some of the land back actions that have been taking. We had discussions about that, and then we made these panels. So you can see how the photographs that we were showing influenced that image. And then next to that there, we've got Sherry Waterman Hopper, who is Haudenosaunee traditional dancer. And you can see here she's posing next to an image that I used to make of her, which I used to make the image behind her. So there is a chance, if anyone has memories of Meadowvale that are particularly iconic, it might be a way to work those into the mural, or at least have them inspire what we're producing there. I think I'm going to stop talking now. I've probably talked for about 40 minutes. If anyone has questions about anything that I've spoken about, I'm more than happy to answer them. We still have quite a bit of time left. If anyone wants to share anything, I'm here to listen. Yeah. So thanks very much, everyone. Yawe goa. That's how we say thanks in Mohawk.